Welcome to the Living Out podcast, helping people, churches and society talk about faith and sexuality.
Welcome to the latest episode of the Living Out podcast. And in this series, we're helping churches to be biblically inclusive. That's to say, churches that hold to the Bible's teaching that sex is for a marriage between a man and a woman, but are seeking to be inclusive of all people, whatever their sexuality, whoever they're attracted to. My name's Andy. I work as the training director of Living Out, and I'm joined by my friends Ed and Anne. Well, we're coming to the end of the church audit, the 10 statements about being a biblically inclusive church, and we're going to touch on issues of singleness today. Now, that's going to raise some serious issues, but I thought we'd be light-hearted to start off with. So, the three of us, we're all single, we're not married. Are there any times, Anne, when you think, oh, I am quite glad I'm single?
Yeah, I mean, when I was thinking about this, there are definitely times where I think I'm glad I haven't got kids. So I was at an ice cream van over the weekend and there was a child screaming her head off. And I just thought, I get the luxury of being able to walk away from that. The poor parents were trying to sort of tell her why she couldn't have an ice cream.
Ed, are there any times you've thought, I'm glad I'm single?
Oh, well, every time I'm in a bookshop, basically, because I can buy as many books as I like and I'm not having to take them home. My dad used to sort of sneak books home, under his jumper because he'd be worried that my mum would discover that there were another five or 10 books coming into the house, and I can just walk in with no shame or embarrassment at all. That, for instance, yesterday I just happened to bump into a bookshop, just happened to go in and just happened to walk away with 10 books. This is a regular occurrence. Nobody monitors it at all, and it is I was going to say it's a benefit. It's probably an unfortunate benefit for the structure of my house in being single.
Yeah, actually, mine is sort of similar to that, but is to do with sort of watching football and rugby matches. So I remember chatting to a mate of mine who we both love rugby, and I was sort of asking him, hey, did you see the match yesterday? To which his response was, no, I'm married. So to be honest, I delight in the freedom to spend Saturday afternoons without any children to look after, watching whatever sporting event happens to be on. Now, there are more serious points that we'll get onto, but that's just to kick us off. In a moment, we'll think how churches can be good places for single and married people alike. So in this series, we've been considering our Living Out audit. That's 10 statements that help churches think how they can be welcoming places particularly for sexual minority groups, but actually for everybody. And today we're looking at statements 8 and 9. So let me read statement 8. God's gifts of either singleness or marriage are equally promoted, valued, and practically supported in your church family's life together. So why is this so important? Ed, do you want to kick us off?
Well, this is important because I think every church in the UK probably fails this one, because as I go around evangelical churches in particular, I see churches that are great at supporting marriage. And that's good because marriage is a good gift. It needs to be supported. They have marriage courses. They apply into marriages in sermons. People are rightly aware of those who are struggling in a marriage and making sure they're getting all the support and encouragement they need. But when it comes to singleness, there's not similar support. There's not a lot of support for those who are really struggling with singleness. There aren't courses about singleness. There isn't a lot of application in sermons to those who are single. It's an equally good gift from God. But in most churches, if not all churches I've been ever part of or have ever visited, marriage massively promoted, hooray. But singleness not promoted much, which is a huge shame, given how important singleness is in the Bible story, how the fact that, Jesus and Paul themselves, both single people, we seem to have built a lot of churches where Jesus and Paul wouldn't have found it very easy to be welcomed and part of things.
Yeah, I agree with what Ed said. I think pretty much every church has the balance skewed towards marriage. I think it's particularly important to redress the balance, because if the church isn't somewhere where single people can thrive and have the intimacy that they need, then they will go elsewhere for that. We all need intimacy. We all need good friendships, deep relationship. We need to be known. And of course, that starts with Jesus, but he's given us his body of believers around us who are supposed to be family to us. And if that's not functioning properly, then actually living our sexualities in obedience to Christ and not getting into sexual relationships is going to become that much harder if our church isn't encouraging us in doing singleness well and providing the things that we need.
And it's quite clear, isn't it, that biblically both marriage and singleness are good gifts. So Paul in 1 Corinthians 7 will talk about one has one gift, another has another. Marriage and singleness are equally good gifts. But I think it can be easy for the church to give the impression that marriage should be the goal for everybody. I remember a few months ago, actually, somebody a little bit older than me who was connected with the church got engaged. And there was a sort of WhatsApp thing sort of going around, and there were sort of beeps going off all day saying, hey, wonderful, isn't it great? And so on, beep, 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 all the way through sort of on my phone. And actually, as the day went on, I became slightly worried because people were saying, hey, at last, finally he's managed it, as though this is the sort of great goal of life. And so, to be honest, I just sent a sort of message into the WhatsApp group saying, I'm sure we were all equally pleased when he was single and serving the Lord, which was great because nobody dared send another message after that and it all went quiet. But I remember the sort of, at last, finally he's managed it, giving the impression that marriage was the goal we should aspire to in a way that actually isn't biblical, to be honest.
And it's so important, isn't it, for us to recognise what are the stories we're telling in the subculture of our churches. And the story we're often telling is that life is lived happily ever after when you find a husband or wife. And your story illustrates that. But often the stories that we're telling our children, the expectations we're giving our children in particular are, when you grow up, you will meet someone, you will fall in love, and you will get married and live happily ever after, just like as your parents. And that is a great story to tell them if it becomes true, but it's a massively dangerous story to tell them if either it doesn't become true, they never meet anybody, or if they are same-sex attracted and you suddenly say, oh, actually, no, that story is no longer applicable or relevant or possible for you. We've told them such a powerful story. That they're going to end up getting married to somebody of the same sex because they've been told a story that promises them that is how you live happily ever after. And in a lot of our churches, unconsciously, not really thinking about it, we're telling people the story that ends with, and they got married and they all lived happily ever after. And that's damaging for same-sex attracted people in our churches, but also anybody that's single in our churches, or anybody that's in a marriage that turns out hasn't meant that they're living happily ever after.
Yeah, it's interesting, isn't it? I've yet to meet any parents who want their children to be single. And I think I think that's a massive pressure, actually, that, parents naturally, I suppose, want grandchildren, but often it's quite an unreasonable expectation to put on children. I would hope that if I was a parent, I would be equally excited if my son or daughter was single and wholeheartedly committed to serving the Lord. I'd be more pleased about that than if they were sort of a half-hearted Christian or not a Christian and married, producing grandchildren and that kind of thing. So I think we need to... I think a challenge to parents is reset your expectations for your children. Is the most important thing that you want for them to be wholeheartedly serving the Lord, or is it that they do the nuclear family thing and fulfill those expectations?
Yeah, I was talking to a couple of parents in my local church whose daughter had just gone off to university. She's a Christian involved in church and CU, and this daughter's been amazed at how everybody's obsessed with getting married. And she's grown up in a family where, marriage has been presented as a great gift, but also singleness has. And she just couldn't work out why everybody was so preoccupied with finding the person to end the story and they all live happily ever after with. And her parents really sweetly were reflecting on the fact that the reason that's the case for their daughter is because they've been affected by the ministry of Living Out, and they know and love me, and they have told their daughter different stories because of some of what we said. And I think that's been a massive encouragement to me to hear that and to know that there are people who are telling alternative stories in which their children end up single and have a good life.
In some ways, being a pastor has helped me quite a bit because you kind of get to know what's going on in people's lives. I mean, I'm aware we need to be realistic about this. Singleness does have its moments of challenge. There are times of loneliness. There are times it would be nice to have somebody else around. That there are pains in singleness. But actually, one of the joys in some ways of being a pastor, of getting to know couples well, is just the sheer realism of how hard marriage is at times. It's interesting, isn't it? Paul talks about those who are single being spared many troubles. For Paul, being married, there's a realism. There's a sort of being divided between trying to keep spouse happy and keep the Lord happy. Part of it is just the realism we need of, singleness can be hard at times, but frankly, so can marriage. And we just need to reflect that better. Because often in our churches, people aren't honest about their marriage difficulties, understandably, I suppose. But it means we get a false image of what's actually going on in married life.
Yeah, and I mean, it's lovely to go to a church wedding, isn't it, and to celebrate on the day with a happy couple, and it is a celebration, it is a fun time. But I'm always struck by the wedding vows that talk about for better or worse, for richer, for poorer, in sickness and in health. And I think when couples choose to say those, I think it's a helpful anticipation that marriage isn't all rosy. It isn't always going to be easy. And I think sometimes as a single person, it's quite helpful for me to reflect on the fact that, in a marriage, you will often have to deal with things like supporting a spouse through redundancy or whatever, or conflict, different expectations, having to resolve difficult issues, parenting children, supporting somebody with ill health. You may well become a long-term carer for somebody, or your spouse may even lose their faith. You may have very difficult in-laws. So there are lots of things in marriage that we don't necessarily have at the forefront of our minds when we've got this Disney Hollywood vision of happily ever after.
So we're probably saying we need some realism about both singleness and marriage, and that would help us as a church. Are there any ways the church can get better on this? I mean, I understand the pressure as a pastor. I actually get to conduct weddings, and generally I don't say, hello everybody, this is an okay day, but it would have been all right if they'd stayed single. I don't tend to introduce weddings that way. So are there any ways we can move forward on this as a church so that singleness and marriage are equally valued?
Well, I was massively encouraged once to be asked by a church to take part in the teaching of a day on singleness. And I'd expected it would be all the single people in the church, but actually they sort of basically made it a 3-line whip for everybody in the church. They said, we're going to do a day on singleness. We want everybody to come. We want everybody to hear what it's like to be single. And that was, it was a massive encouragement for me speaking, but it was also clearly a massive encouragement to all the single people in that church that this conversation was happening with their married friends in the room. And I would love churches where actually there can be teaching on marriage, which single people can go along to and encouraged to go along to so they can support their married friends, and teaching on singleness that married people are listening to so they can support their single friends. And I think the other little practical step we've done here in Bristol is, as a staff team, we're always reading books, and I just made everybody read Kate Wharton's book, Single Minded. And a lot of my staff colleagues got married in their early 20s after going out of university. They don't really know what it's like to be single at all. And reading Kate's book, which is a beautifully honest, very funny sort of, and, at times poignant account of what it's like to be single, was just eye-opening for a lot of my married colleagues. And if you are married and you've been married for a long time, you don't know what it is to be single, perhaps one of the best things you could do is pick up Kate's book, Single Minded.
Yeah, it's a great book. I've read that. I think as well, it's really helpful to listen to single people's voices and try and include single people in the whole life of the church. So, I mean, I went to a church once where every single leader was a white, middle-aged, middle-class married man. And, clearly they're all going to be speaking about the same kind of experiences. Sermon illustrations were always to do with spouse and kids. And I think it's just sort of checking ourselves that we are including people's life experience and not using sermon illustrations that are always about marriage and children. Making sure that people who are speaking into the life of the church, setting direction, planning talks, planning youth work. We have people of a range of experiences and backgrounds involved in that. Otherwise, it's very easy for single people to feel like they're not at the heart of church life, and they get marginalised and just feel like invisible, or feel like, this church isn't for me. So yeah, it's not a tokenism thing, but I think it's important to make sure that single people are listened to properly and, held in esteem and, given positions of leadership.
It's probably good to pick up Jesus' singleness as we speak, actually. When we talk about Jesus, there are various aspects of his character and his life we want to mention. Just again, particularly for a church leader, every so often reminding people that Jesus was single is just a really helpful thing to do when we talk about his humanity. And of course, as part of living as a human being, he lived with all the challenges of being single. That's just a point we want to make every so often, so that it's underlined for people. Well, as well as holding up marriage and singleness equally, we're going to think in a moment about what it means to be church family together.
Hello, Anne here to plug an excellent short booklet by our very own Andrew Bunt called People Not Pronouns, Reflections on Transgender Experience. It's a really helpful introduction to Christian engagement around transgender, focusing on people rather than politics. He explores God's heart for those suffering, as well as biblical teaching around identity and the body. He also offers hope for those experiencing the pain of gender dysphoria. You can get your copy from grovebooks.co.uk.
Well, we've put statement 8 and 9 together because they follow on from each other. So let me read statement 9. Church family members instinctively share meals, homes, holidays, festivals, money, family life with others from different backgrounds and life situations to them. Now, I suspect this is trying to correct something. Ed, you put this together. What were you trying to correct when you put statement 9 in?
Well, I suppose just the attitude, particularly in Western society, that your nuclear family, your biological family, is everything. The church has understandably been worried about the breakdown of family life and has responded to that by encouraging, I think, an idolatry of husband and wife, 2.4 children, and has given the impression that that is the basic building block of church life and what we need to preserve most of all. When actually Jesus himself never ever says anything that positive about nuclear family, about biological family. Tim Chester, the author, points out that there's nowhere where he says it is really important that people live in nuclear families and that biological families are the building block of a good, just society. That may be sort of statistically true, but it isn't something that Jesus is teaching and urging. In fact, Jesus redefines family life. In Matthew 12, he describes those who follow him, those who obey his word, those that put his word into practice as his family. And the fact that that's just not a sort of an illustration, but actually is a reality, is picked up by the Apostle Paul in his letters. His default way of addressing fellow Christians is sister and brothers. He refers to some of his young co-workers as his sons, Timothy, my dear son. And in a letter like 1 Timothy, the way of referring to the church family that Timothy is pastoring is family, is a household, is at the household of faith. And so we need to recognize that talking about church as family is not just a bit of a PR thing, but actually is a spiritual reality that Jesus first talked about in the Gospels, and that the church has lived out right from the beginning of its existence in the apostolic age.
And that really matters, doesn't it, when we think about issues of sexuality, of same-sex attraction. We're encouraging those who experience same-sex attraction not to have a sexual relationship. We can't be saying to people that the alternative in life is basically a sexual relationship or loneliness and misery. We need to be holding out to people the possibility of emotional intimacy, of connection, of family relationships. And that will only be the case if people grasp we're all part of two families, a physical family and a church family, and they're at least equally important biblically.
Yeah, I think that's really important, because I think sometimes there is a false dichotomy presented between, the only way to have the intimacy that you need is a sexual relationship. Otherwise, you're just a kind of, you've just got to try and cope on your own, and you'll be lonely and miserable and grit your teeth until you get to heaven, kind of thing. But actually, a thriving church community and intimacy in numerous relationships is the only way to make singleness plausible, really. You can't do singleness well on your own. And as Ed says, it's not single people who need to read the books, it's married people, it's the whole rest of the church community. We are called to be family together. And so, it's absolutely fundamental that we get this right.
So let's come up with our stories then of where this has worked well. Have any of us got stories of our own experience where church really has been family to us?
As I look at the list that's part of the statement, I can think of people who do instinctively share meals. Somebody in my church family found out that I didn't have any plans for Easter Sunday lunch, so I was, well, come around then. I've got in my pocket my house keys, but I've also got the keys for another couple's house in church because they've given me some keys because I'm that much part of their family. I go on holidays with a whole group of friends, some from church now, some from previous churches. When it comes to Christmas and Easter, people are instinctively thinking, what's Ed doing? Let's invite him along. When I needed to buy a house, it was friends from church family, brothers and sisters who provided the money for a deposit. When it comes to family life, I'm the godfather to 13 godchildren, and I'm the legal, I'm the legal guardian to 2 sets of kids, which shows that I have been invited into the family life of loads of brothers and sisters in Christ. So that's how it's I've been on the receiving end of this sort of thinking, this sort of biblical practice in action.
Wow. I think for a while I was guilty of doing what sometimes can happen when you're single, and expecting the married people to make everything better for me, expecting them to kind of invite me into their life and to be the ones that are initiating all the time. But I've been challenged over the years, really, how can I do community well? How can I know I'm a single person, and I can't cook or anything like that, so I'm not going to be throwing massive dinner parties, but how can I be doing hospitality? How can I be welcoming and opening my life up to other people? And actually, a number of years, 14 years ago now, I started sharing a house with a friend. And our whole vision behind the house was for it to be a community house, for it to be a place where people can experience gospel living. And so we've often had people coming to stay for varying lengths of time. We have a room that we call the Cwtch, which is Welsh, and it means safe place and hug. And it really encapsulates what we wanted to do. So we often have people staying, we look after them and, give them some prayer and that kind of thing. And they just join in life. We've got a key box on the side of the house, and, people can sort of come and go. And, often people come around when we're not even here, and kind of use the house. And, it very much feels like this is something that God's given us that we want to use to bless other people. And in that, receive the kind of friendship and the intimacy in the community that we need to thrive as Christians as well.
Yeah, I think it's really important just to pause and reflect on what Anne's just said, in the sense of single people waiting for church family to look after you. It's actually, if you want that to happen, you need to be a church family member and see how you can look after others. And just waiting for this, as it were, to be laid on a plate for you is unrealistic. You've got to take a step forward. You've got to take the initiative.
It would be lovely if people listening to the podcast actually consciously went away and did some thinking. Who would benefit from this? Who can I consciously include within my family? I had a lovely text from a friend a couple of months back, and he knew I was wrestling and thinking through a particular issue, and I talked about it with a group. And actually about a day or so later, he just texted me to say, I suddenly realised you don't have anybody to talk to most of the time. If ever you want to talk this through, get in touch. And it was just a lovely act of him having thought about my situation and entered into it. And there are loads of situations like that. So who in your church family won't have anybody who organises an event for their birthday, say? It's funny, actually, we've often talked about weddings being a great time to celebrate couples, and you get anniversaries and so on. Often for single people, there's nobody who would necessarily organise something for their birthday. That might be one opportunity to celebrate single people in your church family, is to make more of their birthdays, assuming they would want you to do that. Might be one way of moving forward. But it's just that conscious, I'm going to think about what I can do to make sure everybody is part of a family.
I do think we need to be creative about thinking how we can do life together, because I think one of the things that's difficult in churches is we often have quite packed programmes, we have meetings all over the place, and often people are reluctant to commit to more things. And, nobody wants more meetings and AGMs and stuff like that. But how can we integrate our lives into each other's? So one thing I try to do is just kind of do errands and chores with other people. You've got to go to the supermarket to buy food. You've got to go to the post office to post a parcel. Who could I involve in this? So I can see people as part of my daily life rather than it having to be a big planned event. I think it's helpful just to sort of, rub up against people in different... I'm not going to say that. That sounds rude. Sorry. I think it's really helpful to just be able to involve people in the ordinary stuff of life that you do anyway, so you're not having to clear out extra space in your diary. One of the things that we've tried at church, which has been quite helpful, we've got a very diverse congregation, and we just wanted to work out how we can hang out together a bit more. So we tend to just open the church building and have what we call Big Church Night In, totally unstructured, there's no agenda or anything, but people just bring food and essentially treat the church like a living room, and whatever they'd be doing at home, they bring and do it at the church. So, you might have some work to do, bring your laptop and just sit in the church and do your work with other people around. You might be doing some knitting. You might really enjoy playing cards and want to have a game of cards with somebody. It's that kind of very casual, very low key. But rather than doing all these things in our separate little boxes in front of Netflix, why don't we do these things together? And I found that really great for building friendship and feeling like you belong.
And it's worth, isn't it, signaling that it benefits everybody, that it's good for single people, but it's also good for marrieds, for families, for the widowed, for the divorced. It's good for people who are old, who are young. This is good for the benefits of this are for everyone. I was really struck recently by reading, stats that say that the kids and the teenagers that stay Christian, one of the determining factors is whether they have had someone in their life who's sort of been a sort of halfway house between them and their parents. Someone where bridges the gap between the generations and who's been able to model Christ for them in a less intense way than parents have to. And that is one of the significant things for people staying Christian, keeping trusting in Jesus, is just having other people in their lives, other adults in their lives who parent them in different ways and who can be mentors for them in different ways. So this is obviously good for single people, but it's really good for families and for kids and for everyone. It's great for mission and evangelism as well, because this means our churches become distinct communities that don't make sense if it isn't, the fact that we're all related in Jesus. And people see that we do community in a totally different way to anybody else around us.
It's almost like the Bible knows what it's talking about, isn't it?
It's almost as if that is the case. You discovered it first here on the Living Out podcast.
Andrew Bunt, who's normally with us and isn't today, he also actually knows what he's talking about. And he's written quite extensively on this issue. So it's worth checking out his stuff on the website. It's a couple of articles, Power in the Mundane and Singles Need Family Time Too, which I think is one of the most read articles that we've put out. So do check out Andrew's thoughts on this subject as well.
Andrew's also written a really helpful article called What Does Jesus Teach About the Nuclear Family, which picks up some of the biblical stuff that Ed was taking us through earlier. And we've got lots on singleness on our website. Just particularly for the women listeners, there's a talk on there called Securing Singleness that I did at a women's convention, and that might be particularly helpful and give some ideas about how you can live your singleness well.
Thanks, Anne. Well, this concludes our look through the 10 statements to make the church biblically more inclusive. We have, though, got a special episode coming up in 2 weeks' time when we're going to chat to a church leader who's used these statements to reflect on his own church, and we'll hear how he got on. But thanks for listening. Do subscribe to us so that you know when the next episode drops. Do send in a positive review if you have a positive review, and join us for the next episode. Thanks ever so much for listening.